out on the unforgiving edge of the Dakota Territory, where the sky is a brutal, endless blue, and hope dies quicker than a thirsty horse, a woman's life could be measured in dust and heartbeats. For Clara May Thompson, a widow abandoned to the prairie, each sunrise was a battle. She thought she was utterly alone, armed with nothing but grit and a ghost of a memory. But one scorching afternoon, the river coughed up a secret, a man caught between this world and the next, whose life would either be her damnation or her salvation. This isn't just a story of the West. It's the story of how a single act of mercy forged an unbreakable vow in the heart of a warrior. The dust was a living thing. It coated Clara May Thompson's tongue, settled in the creases of her worn calico dress, and drew a fine, gritty film over the panes of her small cabin window. It was the summer of 1876, a year of scorching sun and simmering blood across the territories, but out here on the lonely stretch of land bordering the Black Hills, the only war was the one Clara fought against the silence. Her husband, Jebediah, had been a man full of loud promises and cheap whiskey. He'd seen gold in the glint of every rock and a fortune in every sunset. He'd bought this plot of land not for its fertile soil, but for its proximity to the rumored gold fields, dragging Clara from her modest but comfortable life back east. He dug and blasted and drank until his dreams and his credit ran dry. 6 months ago, he'd ridden off with 2 other prospectors, promising to return a rich man. He never returned at all. Word eventually trickled back to the nearby town of Redemption's Bluff that his party had been found by U.S. Marshals, victims of a raid or a dispute, their bodies left for the vultures. Jebediah had left her with nothing but a stubborn mule named Patience, a leaky roof, and a crushing debt to the most powerful man in the county, Silas Blackwood. Blackwood owned the town's saloon, its largest ranch, and it seemed its soul. He was a man carved from granite and greed with eyes as cold and grey as a winter river. He'd visited Clara twice since Jebediah's death. The first time he offered condolences that sounded more like a threat. The second time, a week ago, he'd been blunt. The debt on the land was due. He'd give her 1 more month. "A woman alone has no business out here, Mrs. Thompson." He'd said, his voice a low rumble as he looked not at her, but at the horizon, as if already measuring the boundaries of his new property. "This land requires a firm hand." His gaze had then dropped to her, a chilling inventory that made her skin crawl. Or a cooperative spirit. Now that month felt like a lifetime and a minute all at once. Every creak of the floorboards, every howl of a distant coyote sent a jolt of fear through her. She was a prisoner on her own land. This afternoon was different. The heat was a physical weight, pressing down on the parched earth. As she hauled 2 buckets of water from the creek that snaked through the back of her property, she heard it not the familiar sounds of the prairie, but a low, guttural moan. It was so faint she thought it was the wind whistling through the cottonwoods. She froze her heart, hammering against her ribs. Raiders, outlaws. Her hand instinctively went to the small holstered pistol on her hip, a worn Colt that Jebediah had left behind. It was heavy, unfamiliar, but in recent weeks it had become her only companion. She set the buckets down silently and crept toward the sound, moving through the tall grass that bordered the creek. The moaning came again, weaker this time, a sound of pure agony. She peered through a thicket of willows, and her breath caught in her throat. There, half in and half out of the shallow water, was a man. He was Lakota. That much was clear from his buckskin leggings and the single soot-stained eagle feather tangled in his long black hair. His back was a canvas of dried blood and raw wounds. A deep gash ran across his ribs, and his face, turned partly towards her, was bruised and swollen. He was lean but powerfully built, though now he lay broken like a great hawk fallen from the sky. He was dying. Every instinct, every warning she'd ever heard from the fearful townsfolk of Redemption's Bluff screamed at her to run. To go back to the cabin, bar the door, and pretend she'd seen nothing. He was a savage, they'd say, more dangerous than a rattlesnake. Helping him would be inviting death to her door. Silas Blackwood would use it as another excuse to cast her out, labeling her an Indian lover. She took a step back, her heel snapping a dry twig. The sound was like a gunshot in the silence. The man's head moved a fraction of an inch. One eye, barely a slit in the swollen flesh, opened. It wasn't the wild, feral eye of a killer she'd been taught to expect. It was just an eye. Dark, deep, and filled with a pain so profound it transcended language and race. In that fleeting moment, he wasn't a Lakota warrior or a terrifying stranger. He was just a man clinging to the last threads of life. Clara's fear didn't vanish, but something else rose to meet it, a stubborn, defiant spark of humanity that Jebediah's carelessness and Blackwood's cruelty had not yet managed to extinguish. She had been abandoned, left to die in this wilderness. She looked at the man in the creek, and for the first time in months, she saw someone more lost than herself. "Lord have mercy," she whispered to the uncaring sky. She holstered her pistol, took a deep breath, and waded into the creek. The water was cool against her worn leather boots. The man didn't move as she approached, his breathing a shallow, ragged whisper. He was heavier than he looked, all wiry muscle and bone. Gritting her teeth, she hooked her arms under his, her small frame straining against his dead weight. "Come on," she grunted, pulling him from the water's edge. "You're not dying on my land today. I've had enough death for 1 year." She dragged him inch by painful inch across the grass and toward the faint shadow of her cabin. The sun beat down indifferent. The prairie kept its secrets. But in that moment, a new one was being forged, a secret of survival, of a shared desperation that would bind an abandoned widow and a half-dead warrior together against the coming storm. For 3 days the man drifted in and out of a fevered haze. Clara had managed to haul him onto the small cot in the corner of her one-room cabin, a space that now seemed impossibly crowded with his presence. The air was thick with the scent of blood sweat and the pungent herbs she'd gathered from the creek-bed yarrow to pack the wounds and willow bark she brewed into a bitter tea to fight the fever. She worked tirelessly, driven by a force she didn't understand. She cleaned his wounds, her stomach churning at the sight of the raw, angry flesh. There were bullet grazes, a vicious cut on his side that she stitched closed with a trembling hand, and a sewing needle and bruises that spoke of a brutal beating. This was no random raid. This was personal. During his brief moments of lucidity, his eyes would open dark and unreadable. They would follow her movements, filled not with gratitude, but with a guarded, animalistic intensity. He was a warrior, and to be this helpless was a torment worse than any physical pain. He refused her water at first, his jaw clenched tight. Clara, frustrated and exhausted, finally pressed a damp cloth to his cracked lips. "Drink," she commanded, her voice firm, "or I'll have wasted my time dragging you all the way up here." His eyes flickered a spark of surprise in their depths. Perhaps he expected tears or coddling. He finally parted his lips and allowed a few drops to trickle into his mouth. It was a small victory, a tiny crack in the wall between their worlds. She learned his rhythms, the shudders that racked his body as the fever peaked, the low murmurs in a language that was as musical as it was foreign, the way his hand, even in sleep, would clench into a fist as if grasping for a weapon. On the 4th day, the fever broke. She awoke to find him sitting up his back, ramrod straight, despite the pain it must have cost him. He was watching her, his gaze clear and sharp for the first time. The silence in the cabin was heavy, charged with unspoken questions. "You are awake," she said, stating the obvious. She stood and stirred the embers in the hearth, adding a piece of wood. He said nothing, merely inclining his head a fraction. His eyes took in every detail of the cabin, the sparsely filled shelves, the mended patches on her dress, the single faded photograph of her parents on the mantelpiece. It was the look of a scout, a hunter assessing his surroundings for threats and opportunities. "My name is Clara," she offered, deciding that silence was its own kind of enemy. He watched her for a long moment before he spoke. His voice was a low rasp, rough from disuse. "Chaitton." The name meant falcon in his language, though she wouldn't know that for some time. To her it was just a sound, a name for the wild, wounded man who now occupied her home and her thoughts. Slowly, a fragile routine formed. He began to eat the thin broth she made, then solid food. He moved with a stiff grace, his body a testament to a life of discipline, now fighting to reclaim its strength. They spoke little, their communication, a tapestry of gestures and single words. Water, food, pain. Yet in the shared silence, they learned more than words could say. She saw the pride that warred with his vulnerability. He saw the fierce resilience beneath her weary exterior. One afternoon, as she was mending a tear in his buckskin leggings, he pointed to the pistol on her hip. "You know this?" he asked, his English broken but clear. "Some," she admitted. "Jebediah, my husband, he showed me. But I'm not very good." He held out his hand. Hesitantly, she passed him the Colt. He checked it with an expert's familiarity, his long fingers moving with deft precision. He handed it back. "Tomorrow. I show you." The next day he took her to the clearing behind the cabin. He was still weak, leaning against a tree for support, but his eyes were sharp. "Breathe," he commanded, as she raised the heavy pistol, her arm trembling. "Feel it. Do not fight it. Let it be part of your arm." His instruction was sparse, practical. He didn't praise her. He corrected her. He adjusted her stance, showed her how to align the sights, how to squeeze the trigger instead of jerking it. Under his tutelage, her shots grew steadier, grouping closer together on the old fence post she used for a target. In teaching her to shoot, he was giving her more than a skill. He was giving her a piece of his own power, his own will to survive. It was the first true gift he had to offer. Their cautious peace was shattered a week later. The sound of hoofbeats sent a wave of panic through Clara. It was too early for Blackwood to return. Chaitton, who had been sitting outside carving a piece of wood, moved with a silent, startling speed. He slipped back into the cabin, grabbing the hunting knife she used for skinning rabbits, and flattened himself against the wall beside the door, becoming one with the shadows. Clara smoothed her apron, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm. She stepped onto the porch as two riders reined in their horses. They weren't Blackwood, they were his men. She recognized one of them, a hulking man with a pockmarked face named Luther, who served as Blackwood's primary enforcer. "Mornin', widow." Luther sneered, his eyes roaming over her before settling on the cabin. "Mr. Blackwood was just wondering how you were faring out here all alone. Make sure you ain't come down with a fever, or taken in any stray company." His gaze was pointed. It swept over the clearing, lingering on the creek. Had they found signs, a blood trail she'd missed? "I'm fine," Clara said, her voice steadier than she felt. "And I'm alone." "That's so," the other man chuckled. "Smells a little crowded in there for one person." He sniffed the air, which still carried the faint scent of the herbs she'd used on Chaitton's wounds. Clara's blood ran cold. From inside, she could feel the coiled tension of the man pressed against the wall. He was a predator waiting to strike. One wrong move from her, one hint of suspicion from them, and this cabin would become a slaughterhouse. "I've been boiling herbs," she said quickly, thinking of the willow bark. "For headaches. The sun has been fierce." Luther grunted, unconvinced. He swung down from his horse. "Reckon I'll just take a look inside. Make sure you ain't got rats. Mr. Blackwood is particular about the property." He started toward the steps. This was it. Clara's mind raced. She couldn't let him inside. She had to do something, anything. "Wait!" she said, her voice sharp. Luther paused, one foot on the bottom step, a cruel smile playing on his lips. "Something to say, widow?" Clara looked him straight in the eye, her fear solidifying into a cold, hard stone of defiance. "You tell Mr. Blackwood that this is still my home, and I don't welcome rats of any kind. You're not welcome inside without my permission." The man's smile vanished. He stared at her, his eyes narrowing. He had expected a frightened, pliable woman. He hadn't expected this. The air crackled with tension. From inside, she knew Chaitton was a breath away from lunging. For a long, agonizing moment, the fate of everyone on the homestead hung on Luther's next move. Luther stared at Clara, his hand hovering over the butt of his pistol. The raw nerve she had struck was one of authority. He was used to people cowering, especially women. Her defiance was an insult he was not inclined to forgive. He took another step up his boot, thudding on the wood. "Now you listen here," he began, his voice dropping to a menacing growl. Suddenly the mule patients who had been tied to a nearby post let out a loud, agitated bray and kicked violently against her tether. The sharp sound broke the tense standoff. Luther and his companion flinched, their attention momentarily diverted. It was the opening Clara needed. "My husband may be gone," she said, her voice ringing with a conviction that surprised even herself. "But Sheriff Brody in Redemption's Bluff knows I am here. He also knows of Mr. Blackwood's interest in my property. If anything were to happen to me, he'd have questions. Questions I'm sure Mr. Blackwood would rather not answer." It was a bluff, mostly. Sheriff Brody was a man who prized peace over justice and was deeply in Blackwood's pocket. But Luther didn't know the extent of that relationship. He only knew that an official inquiry, no matter how toothless, meant trouble. He held her gaze for another second, weighing his options. Finally, with a curse under his breath, he backed down the step. "You're a feisty one. I'll give you that," he spat. "But feistiness don't pay debts. Blackwood will be by himself to collect. Soon." He swung back onto his horse, shot one last, lingering glare at the cabin door, and galloped away, with his partner kicking up a cloud of accusing dust. Clara sagged against the doorframe, her legs trembling so badly she could barely stand. The door opened behind her, and Chaitton was there, the knife still in his hand, his eyes burning with a fierce, protective light. He said nothing, but his presence was a solid wall at her back. He had been ready to die for her, a woman who was still a stranger. The incident changed things. The fragile peace was replaced by a sense of shared purpose, an unspoken alliance against a common enemy. Chaitton's recovery accelerated, spurred by the imminent threat. He began to work around the homestead, his movements growing stronger and more fluid each day. He repaired the leaky roof with a skill that suggested he'd built many shelters. He taught her how to set snares, adding rabbit and quail to their meager diet. He showed her which plants were good for eating and which were for medicine knowledge passed down through generations. They still spoke little, but their communication deepened. A shared look across the dinner table, a nod of approval when she hit her target, a quiet moment watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple. A bond was forming, woven from threads of mutual respect and a simmering awareness that neither of them wanted to name. A week later, as promised, Silas Blackwood arrived. He came alone, dressed in a fine black suit that was utterly out of place in the rustic setting. He dismounted his magnificent black stallion and strode to the porch as if he already owned it. Chaitton had seen him coming from a mile away and had vanished into the woods behind the cabin, a silent ghost. "Stay on the porch," he had instructed Clara. "Do not let him inside. Mrs. Thompson," Blackwood said, his voice smooth as oiled leather. "I trust my men weren't too uncivilized last week." "They were trespassing," Clara replied coldly. Blackwood smiled, a reptilian twitch of his lips. "A misunderstanding. They were merely concerned for your welfare, as am I." He stepped closer, invading her space. "The month is almost up. I've come for your answer. The deed to this land or the money Jebediah owed me. $200. $200. He might as well have asked for the moon. She had less than 10 to her name. "I don't have it," she said, her voice tight. "A pity." He sighed, though his eyes gleamed with satisfaction. "But perhaps we can come to another arrangement." He let his gaze drift over her again, the same possessive look from before, only now it was bolder, more predatory. "A woman of your qualities could be a great asset to a man in my position. A companion, a hostess at my ranch. Your debt would be forgotten, of course. You'd be well cared for." The implication was sickeningly clear. He wasn't just offering to buy her land. He was offering to buy her. Revulsion rose in her throat, hot and bitter. "I would rather burn this cabin to the ground with myself inside it," she said, her voice shaking with rage. Blackwood's mask of civility dropped. His face hardened. "You foolish woman. You think you have a choice. This is my world. I will have this land one way or another. Sign it over, or I will have Sheriff Brody evict you for dereliction of debt. You'll be left with nothing but the clothes on your back." He produced a document from his coat pocket and a fountain pen. "Sign it." From the woods, Chaitton watched, hidden in the dense undergrowth. He couldn't hear the words, but he saw the scene unfold, the intimidating posture of the man in black, Clara's defiant stance, the document thrust in her face. And then, as Blackwood spoke again, his voice rising with anger, Chaitton heard something that made his blood turn to ice. He didn't recognize the face, but he recognized the voice. It was the same voice that had echoed in his fever dreams, the voice from the ambush, the white man who had negotiated a trade for a wagon full of prime beaver pelts with his hunting party, the man who had offered them whiskey laced with laudanum, and who, when they were groggy and disoriented, had given the order to his hidden men. "Kill them all. Leave no witnesses. The furs are mine." The memory struck Chaitton with the force of a physical blow, the crack of rifles, the cries of his brothers, the searing pain in his side as he tumbled into the river, the current carrying him away as the massacre unfolded. This man, Silas Blackwood, was not just a threat to Clara. He was the butcher who had slaughtered Chaitton's kin and left him for dead. A guttural sound of pure hatred escaped Chaitton's lips. His personal quest for vengeance and his burgeoning need to protect the woman who had saved him had just converged into a single blazing purpose. Silas Blackwood had to be destroyed. Back on the porch, Clara stood her ground. "Get off my land," she ordered. Blackwood laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "It's not your land for much longer. I'll be back in 2 days. With the sheriff. Have your decision ready." He jammed the papers back into his coat, turned on his heel, and mounted his horse. As he rode away, Clara finally allowed herself to tremble. She felt a presence behind her, and turned to see Chaitton emerge from the tree line. His face was a mask of cold fury, his eyes chips of obsidian. "That man," Chaitton said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "He is the one." Clara stared at him, confused. "The one what?" "The one who led the attack on my people," he said, his hand clenching and unclenching. "He killed my brothers. He left me in that river to die." The air grew still. The weight of his words settled over the small homestead, connecting two seemingly separate tragedies into one sordid tale of greed and murder. This was no longer just about a debt or a piece of land. It was about retribution. "He is coming back in 2 days," Clara whispered, the reality of her situation crashing down on her. "With the law." Chaitton looked from her frightened face to the cabin, then to the vast, open prairie that stretched out before them. His expression shifted from pure rage to something colder, more calculating. The hunter was awake. "Let him come," Chaitton said, his voice quiet but absolute. "This time we will be ready." The next 48 hours transformed the homestead. It was no longer a simple cabin, but a defensible position. Under Chaitton's direction, they worked from dawn until dusk. He had Clara move the water barrels to create cover near the windows. He showed her how to loop a rope from the porch post to the door latch, creating a tripwire. His mind saw angles and vulnerabilities she never could. He wasn't just preparing for a fight. He was preparing for a war. But he knew it wasn't enough. They were 2 people against a man who owned a town. They needed information. They needed supplies. They needed to understand the beast they were about to face. "We go to town," he announced the next morning. Clara stared at him. "To Redemption's Bluff. They'll recognize you. It's too dangerous. They look for a Lakota warrior in buck skins," he said, gesturing to his attire. He then pointed to a set of Jebediah's old clothes she kept in a trunk, worn denim trousers, and a faded flannel shirt. They were too short in the arms and tight across the shoulders, but they would have to do. "Today I am not a warrior. I am a farmhand. Your farmhand." He pulled a dusty, wide-brimmed hat from a hook. "This will hide my face." The plan was audacious, bordering on foolish, but Clara saw the strategic brilliance in it. Blackwood wouldn't expect her to be so bold. They rode towards town on the wagon, pulled by the ever-plodding Patience. Chaitton sat beside her, the hat pulled low, his posture slumped to appear less imposing. But beneath the disguise, Clara could feel the tension radiating from him, a tightly coiled spring. Redemption's Bluff was a single dusty street, lined with wooden storefronts, a general store, a blacksmith, a church, and dominating them all, the grand 2-story Blackwood saloon. As they rode in, people stopped and stared. Whispers followed them like flies. The widow Thompson coming into town after weeks of isolation, and with a stranger, no less. Their first stop was the general store, run by a kind, bustling woman in her 50s, named Martha. She was one of the few people who had shown Clara any sympathy after Jebediah's death. "Clara May, it's good to see you," Martha said, her eyes quickly flicking to Chaitton, who was busying himself examining sacks of flour near the back. "Stocking up, just the essentials," Clara said, forcing a calm smile. She handed Martha a small list flour salt coffee, and at the bottom, a box of .44 caliber cartridges for her Colt. Martha raised an eyebrow at the last item, but said nothing. As she gathered the supplies, she leaned in close. "Be careful, dear," she whispered. "Silas Blackwood was in here yesterday, talking with the sheriff. He said he was finalizing the acquisition of the Thompson plot. He sounded mighty pleased with himself." He doesn't own it yet, Clara said, her voice hard. He owns everything else, Martha replied grimly, her gaze drifting towards the saloon across the street. He's got a new shipment of rifles in, too. Winchester repeaters. Gave one to each of his men. They've been swaggering around town like they've already won a war. The information was a cold knot in Clara's stomach. They weren't just facing men with pistols. They were facing a small, well-armed militia. As they left the store, loading the supplies onto the wagon, the batwing doors of the saloon swung open. A group of men spilled out into the street, laughing loudly. Among them was Luther, and with him was another man whose face Chaitton recognized instantly from the ambush, a wiry man with a scar that cut through his left eyebrow. Chaitton instinctively stiffened his hand, dropping to his side. Clara saw the movement and laid a hand on his arm. "Not here," she breathed. "Not now." He relaxed, but his eyes remained fixed on the men. They hadn't spotted him yet. Luther, emboldened by whiskey, saw Clara across the street. "Well, looky here," he bellowed, drawing the attention of the entire street. "The widow came to town, come to beg Mr. Blackwood for an extension." His friends roared with laughter. Clara's face flushed with humiliation and anger. She ignored them, moving to climb onto the wagon. "And who's this?" Luther sneered, his eyes finally landing on Chaitton. He squinted, trying to get a better look under the hat's brim. "Got yourself some help, have you? Where'd you dig him up from?" Chaitton remained silent, his face obscured, his body turned away as he adjusted a rope on the wagon. He was playing the part of an invisible, inconsequential farmhand. "He's just helping me with some chores," Clara said loudly, trying to draw the attention back to herself. "It's none of your concern." Luther took a swaggering step into the street, his hand on his gun belt. "Everything that happens on that land is my concern, or it will be tomorrow." The tension was palpable. The whole town seemed to be holding its breath. From the sheriff's office, the curtain twitched, but the door remained closed. Sheriff Brody was watching, but he wasn't intervening. Chaitton slowly turned just enough so he could see the men without revealing his face. He was calculating. 2 of them were drunk, sloppy. Luther was confident, arrogant. The man with the scar was watchful, more dangerous. He noted their positions, their weapons, the distance between them. "Let's go, Clara," he said, his voice low and intentionally gravelly disguised. He helped her up onto the wagon seat, his movements calm and deliberate, offering no provocation. Luther seemed disappointed at the lack of a fight. He spat on the ground. "Yeah, you best run along. Enjoy your last night in your own bed, widow." Clara slapped the reins, and Patience began her slow, steady walk out of town. Clara didn't dare look back until they were well clear of the last building. Her hands were shaking. "They're animals," she whispered. "They are men who have forgotten what it is to be men." Chaitton corrected her quietly. "That makes them predictable." He finally looked at her, his eyes dark with the gravity of their situation. "But Martha was right. They are well armed. We cannot fight them head-on." "Not at the cabin." "Then what do we do?" Clara asked, her voice laced with despair. "We can't run. That land is all I have left." Chaitton was silent for a long time as the wagon rumbled along the dusty trail. The homestead was visible in the distance, a tiny, vulnerable speck against the vast landscape. "He wants the land," Chaitton said at last, a new dangerous idea dawning in his eyes. "He expects us to be there, hiding behind the walls of your cabin, a fortress. But a fortress can also be a cage." He looked at the rolling hills, the creek, the rocky outcrops that dotted the landscape around her property. He was seeing it not as a farmer would, but as a warrior. He was reading the land, searching for its secrets. "We will not fight him at the cabin. he said, his voice filled with a chilling certainty. "We will fight him everywhere else." The sun had not yet risen when Blackwood and his men arrived. There were 6 of them, including Luther and the scarred man whose name was Cain. They rode with the arrogance of conquerors, their new Winchester rifles glinting in the pale pre-dawn light. Sheriff Brody was with them, his presence lending a thin, tarnished veneer of legality to the proceedings. They reined in their horses 100 yards from the cabin. It was silent. Too silent. No smoke curled from the chimney. No light flickered in the windows. "She's gone," the sheriff said, a note of relief in his voice. "Probably packed up and ran in the night. Smart woman." Blackwood scanned the homestead, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. "Maybe," he said slowly. "Or maybe she's just hiding. Luther, Cain, go check the cabin. The rest of you spread out. Check the barn." Luther and Cain dismounted and approached the cabin, cautiously, rifles raised. The porch was empty. The door was slightly ajar. Luther kicked it open and stormed inside Cain, covering him. A moment later, they re-emerged. "Empty," Luther called out. "Looks like she cleared out. Some clothes gone. Not much else." Blackwood allowed himself a small, triumphant smile. It had been easier than he'd thought. The widow had folded. "Good. The property is officially in my possession for failure to pay the outstanding debt," he announced to the sheriff, who nodded dutifully. "Torch the barn. I don't want any squatters getting ideas." As 2 of his men dismounted and headed towards the barn with oil and torches, a single gunshot cracked through the morning stillness. It came not from the cabin, but from a rocky outcrop a 1/4 mile to the east. One of the men heading to the barn cried out and fell clutching his leg. "Ambush!" Cain yelled, diving for cover behind a water trough. Blackwood and his men scrambled, their surprise turning to rage. They fired wildly in the direction of the shot, the reports of their powerful rifles echoing across the prairie. From the rocks, Chaitton watched his expression grim. He had aimed for the leg, a deliberate, tactical choice. This wasn't about killing them all, not yet. It was about disorienting them, controlling them, and turning their strength into a weakness. "They are angry," he had told Clara hours earlier as they set up their positions. "They expect fear. We will give them confusion." As the men focused their fire on the eastern rocks, a second shot rang out this time from the dense thicket of willows along the creek to the west. Another of Blackwood's men grunted as a bullet tore through his shoulder, sending his rifle flying. It was Clara's shot. Her heart was pounding, but her hands were steady, just as Chaitton had taught her. Breathe. Feel it. Squeeze. Blackwood's men were now trapped in a crossfire. They were exposed in the open yard of the homestead, with enemies on 2 sides. Their superior numbers and rifles were useless if they didn't know where to shoot. "It's the farmhand, the Indian," Luther roared, finally understanding. "He's out there, find him." Cain, the more tactical of the 2, grabbed Blackwood. "We're sitting ducks here. We need to get to cover the cabin." They scrambled for the dubious safety of the small cabin, dragging their 2 wounded men with them. Sheriff Brody, looking pale and terrified, was the first one through the door. Now the hunters had become the hunted, trapped inside the very cage they had come to claim. The day wore on in a tense stalemate. Any time one of Blackwood's men showed themselves in a window or doorway, a single well-aimed shot would kick up dirt near their feet or splinter the wood frame, driving them back inside. Chaitton and Clara moved, constantly changing positions, making it seem like there were more than 2 of them. They were ghosts, whispers on the wind, their knowledge of the land their greatest weapon. Inside the cabin, frustration was mounting. They were low on water, and their wounded men were moaning in pain. "We can't just sit here," Luther raged. "Let's rush them." "Rush who, where?" Kane shot back. We don't even know where they are half the time. That Lakota knows this land. He's playing with us. Blackwood was silent, his face a thunderous mask of fury. He had been outmaneuvered, humiliated. "When night falls," he said, his voice dangerously low, "we move. We'll slip out the back and circle around through the creek bed. We'll find them. And when we do, I want him alive. I want to look him in the eye before I kill him." But Chaitton knew the mind of his enemy. He knew they would wait for the cover of darkness. As dusk began to settle, painting the sky in soft lavender and grey, he and Clara retreated from their positions and converged at a prearranged spot, the abandoned root cellar dug into the side of a small hill 100 yards behind the barn. Its entrance was hidden by a thick growth of sagebrush. "They will come out soon," Chaitton whispered, as they slipped into the cool, dark space. "They will be angry and careless." They waited. An hour passed. Then, under the faint light of a crescent moon, the cabin door creaked open. Blackwood and his remaining 4 able-bodied men, including the sheriff, slipped out and moved stealthily towards the creek, their forms dark shapes against the landscape. This was the moment Chaitton had been waiting for. He and Clara emerged from the cellar. While he crept towards the horses, still tied up near the front of the cabin, Clara ran to the barn. She didn't carry a torch. She carried the small can of kerosene they had bought for their lamp. Chaitton moved like a shadow, cutting the reins of Blackwood's and his men's horses, sending them scattering with a sharp slap on their rumps. At the same moment, Clara reached the barn. She doused a pile of dry hay near the entrance with the kerosene. Then she struck a match. Whoosh! The dry hay erupted in a brilliant blaze. Flames licked up the old dry wood of the barn, casting a hellish, flickering light across the entire homestead. Out in the creek bed, Blackwood and his men spun around at the sound and the sudden light. They were caught. Silhouetted by the fire, their dark forms were perfect targets against the blazing backdrop. A shot rang out from the darkness near the cabin. Sheriff Brody cried out and crumpled to the ground, a bullet in his thigh. He wasn't dead, but he was out of the fight. It was Chaitton's shot, precise and deliberate. Panic erupted. Blackwood and his men, their nighttime stealth operation completely compromised, turned and fired blindly towards the cabin, but their targets were gone. Clara and Chaitton had already melted back into the shadows. "Our horses!" "They're gone!" one of the men yelled in panic. They were trapped, wounded, exposed. Their plan had not just failed, it had been turned into a disaster. Blackwood, his face illuminated by the fire of the burning barn he himself had ordered destroyed, let out a roar of pure, unadulterated fury. He had lost. Today, he had lost. From a safe distance, Clara and Chaitton watched the chaos. Clara was breathing heavily, the adrenaline of the fight coursing through her. She looked at Chaitton, his face calm and resolute in the firelight. He had not risen to power with swords or armies, but with wisdom, patience, and an unbreakable will. He had protected her. "It's not over," Chaitton said, his eyes still fixed on the scene below. "A cornered wolf is the most dangerous." He was right. As Blackwood and his surviving men, Luther and Kane, dragged their wounded back towards the relative safety of the town, their retreat was not a surrender. It was a promise of a bloodier return. The smouldering ruins of the barn greeted the sunrise, a stark monument to their victory. But it was a hollow triumph. They had won the battle, but Blackwood was still alive, and his hatred would now be a blazing inferno. They had poked the hornet's nest, and the full swarm would be coming. Chaitton knew they could not hold the homestead again. Blackwood would return with more men, perhaps dozens, and lay siege. Their clever tactics wouldn't work against overwhelming numbers. "I must leave," he told Clara as they stood by the creek, the cool morning air a stark contrast to the heat of the previous day's fight. Clara's heart sank. She had come to rely on his presence, on the quiet strength that emanated from him. The thought of being alone again was a cold, physical ache. "Leave, where will you go?" "To my people," he said, his gaze turning north towards the sacred Pahasapa, the Black Hills. "There is a village, led by my uncle Chief Kangi. I must tell them what has happened. Blackwood did not just attack me. He attacked the Lakota. He stole our furs, murdered our hunters. This is a blood debt that must be answered." He turned back to her, his dark eyes intense. "And I cannot fight him and protect you at the same time. Not alone." She understood. This was bigger than her land. This was about his honor, his people, his way of life. "Will they help?" she asked quietly. "My uncle is a cautious man," Chaitton admitted. "The white soldiers are everywhere. The treaties are broken. He fears any fight will bring the army down on us. I must convince him that Blackwood is a poison that, if left alone, will kill us all." The thought of his departure was terrifying, but she nodded, her own resolve hardening. "Then you must go. Go and go quickly." Their farewell was simple, stripped of everything but the raw, unspoken emotions that had grown between them. He stood before her, and for the first time he reached out and gently touched her cheek, his calloused fingers surprisingly soft against her skin. "Clara May," he said, speaking her full name for the first time. "You have the heart of a warrior. Bar the door. Keep the rifle close. Watch the horizon." "I will," she promised, her voice thick. "You. Be safe, Chaitton." He gave a single solemn nod, then turned and loped away, not towards the road, but into the wilderness, moving with the tireless grace of a wolf. She watched until he was a tiny speck on the horizon, and then he was gone. The silence he left behind was heavier and more profound than any she had ever known. True to his word, Chaitton travelled north, living off the land, his senses on high alert. The journey was a pilgrimage, a return to the world he had almost been torn from. 2 days later, he found them a large hunting camp of Sikangu Lakota, nestled in a hidden valley. He was met with suspicion. He was a man presumed dead, returning alone, and wearing the clothes of a white man. But he was recognized, and word was sent to the chief. He was brought before his uncle Kangi, a man whose face was a roadmap of wisdom and sorrow. He listened without interruption as Chaitton told his story, the treacherous trade, the ambush by Blackwood, his wounds, the river, and finally the white woman who had saved his life and fought beside him. When he finished, the council of elders murmured among themselves. "You speak of one white man," Kangi said, his voice deep and resonant. "But we are surrounded by an army of them. To attack this Blackwood is to risk war with all of them. They will use it as an excuse to drive us from these hills forever." "He is not just one man," Chaitton argued, his voice ringing with passion. "He is a disease. He poisons the land with his greed. Today he kills a hunting party for furs. Tomorrow he will kill our women and children for the land itself. We cut out the sickness now, or we let it consume us. You fight for the white woman," another elder accused. "Your heart is clouded." "I fight for justice," Chaitton countered. "The woman showed me that not all of them are our enemies. She showed me honor when my own kind were not there to help. But my fight is for the memory of my brothers that Blackwood slaughtered. It is for our people to show that we will not be prey for any man, white or Lakota." The debate raged for hours. Kangi was torn between his nephew's fire and his own weary pragmatism. The risk was immense, Meanwhile, back at the homestead, Clara's isolation was a breeding ground for fear. She did as Chaitton instructed, keeping watch her rifle never far from her side. She saw riders in the distance, twice scouts from Blackwood's ranch, but they kept their distance wary of another trap. Her lonely vigil was shattered on the third day after Chaitton's departure. It was late afternoon when they came. Not a large war party, but a small, brutally efficient one. Blackwood himself was there, along with Luther Kane and 3 other hard-faced men. They didn't ride up to the cabin this time. They emerged from the woods on foot from all sides, their approach silent and swift. Clara was inside cleaning her rifle when the door burst open. Before she could even raise the weapon, Luther was on her, knocking it from her hands. Kane grabbed her from behind, pinning her arms. Silas Blackwood stepped into the cabin, his face a mask of cold, triumphant fury. His left arm was in a sling, a souvenir from their last encounter. The little widow, he sneered, his eyes filled with venom. All alone. Your savage friend has abandoned you, it seems. Did you really think I would let you get away with what you did? He'll be back, Clara spat, struggling against Kane's grip. And he will kill you. Blackwood laughed, a chilling, humorless sound. Let him come. In fact, I'm counting on it. He nodded to his men. You're going to be the bait, Mrs. Thompson. We're going to my ranch. When your Indian lover comes looking for you, he'll find you. And he'll find me waiting. He grabbed the faded photograph of her parents from the mantelpiece and examined it for a moment, before tossing it into the cold hearth. You made a mistake, Clara. You chose the wrong side. Now you're going to pay for it. They dragged her from the cabin, her home, the place she had fought so fiercely to defend. They tied her hands and threw her onto a horse. As they rode away, she looked back at her small, empty cabin, a symbol of her lost hope. Chaitton had vowed to protect her, but he was miles away, perhaps unaware of her fate. The storm he had warned of had not gathered. It had broken, and she was at its very center. Under the cloak of a moonless night, Chaitton and his 5 warriors descended upon the Blackwood ranch. They moved like vengeful spirits, their first act a silent strike on the horse corral. As the freed herd thundered into the plains, drawing half of Blackwood's men into a chaotic chase, the Lakota scaled the compound walls. Inside, thrown in a damp cellar, Clara had not surrendered to despair. At Chaitton's whistled signal from a ground-level grate, hope surged through her. Freed by his knife, she received her mission. While Chaitton's warriors prepared to strike, Clara crept upstairs and smashed a lantern into Blackwood's study, engulfing the room in flames. As the remaining guards rushed to fight the fire, they were met by a storm of Lakota fury. The fight was swift and lethal. Chaitton and his men secured the house just as Blackwood returned his face, a mask of rage. The final duel unfolded in the yard, silhouetted against the burning house. Blackwood, arrogant and powerful, was no match for Chaitton's righteous vengeance. The fight ended with Chaitton's knife at the throat of the man who had butchered his brothers. For you there is no mercy, he vowed, ending Blackwood's reign of terror. As dawn broke over the smoldering ranch, Clara rushed into Chaitton's arms. His warriors had paid the blood debt. Later, standing on her own porch, she asked what he would do. My path is with my people, he said, taking her hands, but my home is wherever you are. He had risen from near death to protect her, a vow that now sealed their future together in the heart of the Wild West. The story of Clara and Chaitton is a powerful testament to the fact that even in the harshest of lands, the most resilient thing that can grow is the human heart. Theirs was a love forged not in ballrooms or whispered promises, but in the crucible of survival loyalty and a shared fight against tyranny. They remind us that family isn't always the one you're born into, but the one you're willing to fight and die for. Their journey shows that a single act of compassion can change the course of history, and a vow made in the heart of a warrior is truly unbreakable. If their story of courage, love, and justice moved you, please give this video a like and share it with someone who appreciates a tale of the true Wild West. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next story. What part of Clara and Chaitton's journey resonated with you the most? Let me know in the comments below.